Northern France, winter 1944. 2:17 in the morning, a German sentry stands his post outside a farmhouse on the edge of a village 12 miles behind the front line. He has done this 400 nights before. He knows the sounds of this darkness, the wind across the fields, the distant rumble of artillery, the creak of the wooden gate at the end of the lane. He knows what danger sounds like. He does not hear the shot that kills him. There is no crack, no report, no echo. The man to his left, 15 feet away, does not look up. The sentry folds. By the time anyone notices, the thing that killed him is already gone. A weapon so quiet that witnesses standing 10 feet away described the sound as something between a door latch and a leather glove slapping a table. The British De Lisle Carbine. Fewer than 600 were ever made. The Germans never developed a countermeasure for it because most of them never knew it existed. The ones who did know the officers who read the reports, who found the bodies in the morning with no indication of where the shot had come from, who understood that something was operating behind their lines that they could neither hear nor locate. Those men feared it the way soldiers fear the things they cannot explain. This is the story of the quietest weapon of the Second World War, and the dark reason German sentries never heard it coming. To understand what the De Lisle was, you first have to understand what it was not. It was not a suppressed pistol. It was not a silenced submachine gun. Both of those existed. Both had been produced, issued, tested, and found to be useful in limited circumstances. The De Lisle was something categorically different. A full-length bolt-action carbine, accurate to 300 yards, chambered for a pistol cartridge, with an integrated suppressor so thoroughly engineered that it reduced the weapon's report to something barely audible at 20 feet. In practical terms, this meant it was possible to fire the De Lisle carbine from a distance at which the target's comrades could not hear the shot, could not determine the direction of fire, and in conditions of low light might not even identify what had happened as a shooting at all. The German army had no equivalent, not in 1942, not in 1943, not at any point in the war. The most capable German silent fire capability of the war was used exactly once, in a single operation, after weeks of preparation. The British De Lisle was available to any trained operator who needed one, dropped into occupied territory, carried on raids, used by Commandos, by SOE operatives, by the Special Air Service in operations that most of the people who carried this weapon to their graves never confirmed publicly. The number produced fewer than 600 understates the psychological impact entirely. By 1942, the British war in Western Europe had a specific problem that maps and casualty reports did not fully capture. The Germans held the continent. From Norway to the Pyrenees, from the Atlantic coast to the border of Soviet-occupied territory, the Wehrmacht had established a system of control that made conventional military operations impossible. But Western Europe was not empty. The Special Operations Executive had been established in July 1940 by Churchill's direct order, with a mandate to set Europe ablaze. By 1942, SOE had agents operating in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Poland, Yugoslavia, and Greece. Each of those agents had a fundamental problem. They had to move through a world populated by enemy soldiers. Soldiers who stood guard at checkpoints, who patrolled town squares, who stood outside facilities that needed to be entered, who needed to be removed from positions they occupied. Quietly, without alerting anyone nearby, without the shot that would bring a response, lock down the area and turn a successful operation into a massacre. The standard solution was the Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife, effective but requiring the operative to get within arm's reach of the target. A sentry could turn, could call out, could make enough noise before dying that the whole exercise became worthless. What was needed was a weapon that could do what the knife did from a distance. The De Lisle was the answer to that requirement. William Gladstone De Lisle was not a soldier. He was a civilian technical officer working at the Air Ministry in London, and his entry into small arms design was essentially a side project, a problem he had identified and decided to solve in the way that gifted engineers solve problems, by building a prototype and showing it to people with the authority to act on it. De Lisle's insight was precise. The two principal sources of noise from a fired weapon are the propellant gases escaping the muzzle, the bang, and the supersonic crack of the bullet in flight. The second source is what most suppressor designs of the era failed to adequately address. You could muffle the muzzle blast with a sound moderator, but if the bullet was traveling faster than the speed of sound, it produced its own acoustic signature regardless of what you put on the barrel. The crack traveled. It located the shooter as accurately as the shot itself. The solution was a subsonic cartridge. De Lisle chose the .45 ACP, the same cartridge used in the American Thompson submachine gun and the Colt 1911 pistol, already available in large quantities through Allied supply chains. Naturally subsonic at roughly 830 feet per second, well below the 1,125 feet per second threshold of the speed of sound. There would be no supersonic crack, ever. He built the design around the Lee Enfield No. 1 Mark III action, the same bolt mechanism that had served the British Army since before the First World War. Modified to accept the .45 ACP cartridge, with a Thompson pistol magazine feeding into the receiver. The integrated suppressor replaced the barrel jacket entirely. The result? Approximately 85.5 decibels at the muzzle. A standard rifle produces around 160. A heavy rainstorm measures roughly 90. The De Lisle, fired in a rainstorm, was quieter than the weather. De Lisle presented the prototype to the Air Ministry and was told that small arms development was not their concern. He was directed to the War Office. The trials process ground through its normal sequence of evaluations, requests for modification, revised trials, and committee review. By the time the De Lisle had completed the formal approval cycle, more than a year had passed since the first prototype. The bureaucracy had nearly killed the weapon in its infancy. The only reason it survived was that by 1943, the men who needed it were asking for it specifically. The De Lisle's silence was not a trick. It was the product of three engineering decisions that worked together. The first was the cartridge. The .45 ACP is naturally subsonic at all standard loadings. At 230 grains, the bullet is heavy for its diameter, designed to deliver mass at handgun ranges, not velocity. No supersonic crack, no acoustic trail pointing back to the shooter. The second was integration. Unlike earlier British suppressed weapons, where the suppressor attached as a removable component, the De Lisle's baffle stack was aligned precisely with the bore and manufactured as a single unit. There were no joints to loosen, no seals to fail. The suppressor did not degrade with use in the way that attached devices did. The third was the action. A bolt-action rifle produces almost no mechanical noise when handled properly. No blowback, no gas-operated cycling, no reciprocating parts slamming against the receiver. The sound of the bolt cycling was, in field conditions, inaudible beyond a few feet. In that Sentries' last moment, the mechanical click of the bolt was the loudest thing the De Lisle made. At 25 yards, a standard sentry engagement distance, the bullet struck before the sound reached the target's comrades, and the sound itself was insufficient to identify as a gunshot. Approximately 129 standard configuration weapons were produced by the Sterling Armaments Company at Dagenham. A folding stock airborne variant added roughly 100 more. Total production across all variants, somewhere between 500 and 600 weapons. For context, Germany produced over 14 million Carabiner 98K rifles across the war. Britain built 600 De Lisles. Each one went to a man whose job was to move through occupied territory at night and ensure the people guarding it did not see morning. The De Lisle entered service in 1943 and was issued primarily to three groups: British Commandos, SOE operatives in occupied Europe, and members of the Special Air Service. What those three groups had in common was that their operations routinely required the elimination of sentries, the neutralization of guards at specific points, and the crossing of ground that enemy soldiers were standing on. The operational record is, in large part, undocumented. SOE operations were conducted under conditions of extreme secrecy. Many agents did not survive. Many reports were destroyed or never written. What the surviving accounts describe is consistent. Three operational advantages every time. First, range. The ability to neutralize a sentry from a position of cover before entering the target area without triggering the immediate response that a conventional shot would bring. Second, direction ambiguity. In conditions of darkness, a shot that made almost no sound could not be traced to a firing position. Third, and perhaps most significant, the effect on the enemy personnel who found the aftermath. A sentry killed by a knife had been killed at close range. Someone had been that close. The area search following a knife kill concentrated on the immediate vicinity. A sentry killed by a weapon no one had heard raised a different kind of alarm. The search was wider. The uncertainty was greater. The question of where the shooter was and whether they were still there was impossible to answer. German after-action reports from operations in France and Norway described the pattern. Sentries found dead, no shot heard, no firing position identified, no clear direction of approach. In documented cases, the German response was to increase sentry numbers and change patrol timing across an entire sector. A significant commitment of resources triggered by a single, inaudible weapon that most German soldiers had never seen and would not have recognized by name. The sentries who replaced them knew what had happened to the sentries before them, and that knowledge did its own work. The German army was not unaware of suppressed weapons. The concept was understood. Individual German engineers had produced functional suppressors for standard service weapons. The question is why Germany never fielded anything equivalent to the De Lisle at operational scale. The answer is largely doctrinal. German military philosophy through 1942 was built around decisive force, overwhelming firepower, speed of advance, coordinated combined arms operations. Suppressed weapons are, almost by definition, tools of patience and precision. Tools for the side that needs to work carefully through territory it does not control. Germany, in 1941 and 1942, controlled the territory. The operational requirement that produced the De Lisle did not exist for German forces in the same form. By 1943, when Germany was increasingly on the defensive, German special operations units were performing exactly the kind of sentry neutralization and infiltration work that the British were doing with the De Lisle in occupied Europe. But the German procurement system never defined the operational requirement clearly enough to commission the solution. The men who needed it were not talking to the men who could have built it. By 1944, German production capacity was being bombed around the clock. Specialist low-volume weapons with narrow operational applications were not going to receive factory time that could be used for Tigers, 88s, and the V-weapons program. The De Lisle's operational window, 1943 to 1945, coincided almost exactly with the period during which German production flexibility had essentially disappeared. Here is what the De Lisle Carbine's production figures do not tell you. Fewer than 600 were made. The confirmed kill count is unknown. The number of sabotage operations that the De Lisle enabled by removing the sentry who would otherwise have prevented entry is completely unrecorded. But consider the arithmetic from the German side. Every sentry found dead with no audible discharge, no identified shooter, no clear direction of fire, consumed German resources disproportionate to the cost of killing him. Investigations were opened, patrol patterns were changed, additional sentries were posted, sectors were locked down. Each of those responses was a diversion of manpower and attention from the actual fighting front. More than that, the SOE's sabotage operations that the De Lisle helped enable produced effects that can be measured. The Norwegian heavy water sabotage delayed the German nuclear program. The destruction of French rail infrastructure before D-Day, which the De Lisle's quiet clearance of sentries helped make possible, contributed directly to the disorganization of German reinforcement routes in the critical weeks after the 6th of June, 1944. You cannot draw a direct line from a De Lisle shot to any of those outcomes. That is not how special operations work. Special operations work through enabling conditions, by opening the door, by silencing the alarm, by creating the window of time during which the real damage gets done. The De Lisle was that capability, in physical form, in the hands of the men who needed it most. Britain was fighting a war in which the occupied populations were a strategic asset, in which the ability to move through enemy-held ground silently, to remove the sentries who stood between the saboteur and the objective, was as valuable as any conventional weapon in the arsenal. The De Lisle Carbine was the physical expression of that understanding. Fewer than 600 existed. They were enough. The De Lisle did not stop being useful when Germany surrendered. Surviving carbines went to Korea, to Malaya during the emergency, to Vietnam, where American Special Forces units carried them into the 1960s, and by some accounts to Northern Ireland, where SAS units are reported to have carried them into the 1970s. A weapon built at a car factory in Essex in 1942 remained in active Special Forces use for 30 years after the war it was built for ended. Not because it was cutting-edge technology, because the requirement it solved never went away. The engineering principles William De Lisle worked out at the Air Ministry in 1942, subsonic cartridge, integral suppressor, manual bolt action, are the same three-point logic that defines every modern suppressed precision rifle used by Special Operations Forces today. He arrived at the answer before anyone was asking the question officially. He received no public recognition for it. The Air Ministry had told him the De Lisle was not their concern. The men who used it in the field were not permitted to discuss what they had done with it. The German sentries who never heard the shot have no memorial. The operations it enabled are still, in many cases, classified. What remains is the engineering, and the understanding that silence is not a trick, but a design philosophy. The dark reason German sentries never heard the British De Lisle Carbine is not simply a function of the weapon's engineering, though the engineering was remarkable. It is a function of what one engineer at the Air Ministry understood while he was shooting rabbits for his family's dinner. That some problems cannot be solved loudly. That the man standing between an operation and its objective does not need to be defeated. He needs to be removed without his colleagues knowing he is gone. The De Lisle did not change the battlefield. It changed what happened in the 40 seconds before the battle began. And sometimes 40 seconds is the entire war. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and make sure notifications are on. What's coming next will be worth the wait.